Oh. Thank you. My name is Evan Greenwood, and this is Ruan Rothmann. We both work at Free Lives in South Africa. We're involved in two different projects, both in VR, and like it was introduced, one of the problems that we're trying to solve, or the challenges we've set for ourselves, is to create immersive physical environments can be interacted with and respond in believable ways. Before I continue, I just want to play a little bit of a trailer of the thing I'm working on with the team, just to kind of explain kind of maybe give some idea what it is. It's this. So I think it's fair to say, Ruan's going to introduce his game a little bit later, but I think it's fair to say both these games are experimental to varying degrees in nature. And like I said, this is a challenge that we've set ourselves. To tell a bit of the story, I feel like it's worth mentioning motion controls are nothing new. We've had motion controls on every major recent gaming platform. There was the Connect, there was the PlayStation Move, these guys playing StarCraft here, and there was the Wii. And all of these platform holders eventually kind of distance themselves in terms of their strategy from these motion controllers, Wii being the most successful, but even Nintendo doesn't use it for most of its games these days. I think that's fair to say. So it leaves us here today. We got virtual reality, and the platform holders seem quite determined. Well, they seem to believe that motion controls are a part of the virtual reality future, and I think this is true. I think motion controls now have vastly better tracking, and I think given the perspective that the most compelling experiences in virtual reality are played from a first-person perspective, having hands in the world gives the world a lot of substance. And this is an advantage that maybe the previous motion controls never had. The previous motion controls all, a lot of them used avatars. You would be swinging something around, and there'd be a character on screen that would also be swinging something around. We no longer have that in virtual reality, and it may have been true before as well, but conventional verbs definitely don't work. Conventional game verbs don't work in virtual reality. You can't press an X button and kind of get someone to attack or pick up a phone or whatever. Those things have to happen directly now. or at least they feel terrible if they don't. And interpretive controls where it takes like a swipe, a gesture of the hand, and converts that into an action, like kind of feel terrible. And there are games in virtual reality that do this, that when your sword passes through a monster, it takes X amount of damage, and it plays a canned animation. Like this kind of thing happens. And I don't think this is the future. But as soon as you try and make these worlds spatially contiguous and like physically contiguous with the player, you have this problem that nothing in the world has any weight. You can affect it, but it can't affect you at all. The world can't exert any force on the player. So this is kind of going back a bit to our project, but this is, an example of like This is the kind of interaction we find in a lot of the more compelling virtual reality experiences, and this works. And the reason being is that we know we can pick up a rock. We know approximately that a rock is holdable and tossable and catchable and throwable. So it feels immersive. It feels like you're really doing it, which is great. But this is also a very simple action. It's so this works, but we've been trying to do some things that are more difficult than rocks, things that have multiple joints or joints between things, times when it's not going to just follow the player's hand directly, it's going to do something else. So this is an experiment we had with that bird you saw earlier. And what I like here is that the bird is going to drag behind the key, and the fact that there's a joint between them gives you a sense of that there's a relative weight between them. When you're looking at this, your brain can figure out kind of how heavy the one object is based on how it pulls the other object. And I feel like, having played this in VR, I know that this feels a lot better than moving around a rock. And the other great thing about it is that it's an agent. It's a thing that can play a bit of a tug of war on you. So it feels kind of alive. And this is kind of part of our process of trying to make a world that you can interact with, and it is physically kind of reactive in a realistic way. And I think it's one of the things we're not doing is maybe putting a person on the end of that key. Dragging around a person would be just as possible as dragging around a bird, but it wouldn't work because in real life, pulling around a person is ridiculous. Now, there is an experience there that could be compelling, but with the bird, it feels believable given the role of a normal human in the game, which is the story we're trying to tell. So we've been then doubling down on this idea, trying to make a world that then is light, and that the interactions and the movements that the players would make would not be resisted, and that would be believable, that would be immersive. So this is one of the recent scenes we've been working on, where we realize that there's this kind of weightless world, that the world can't act upon you in any way physically. So our solution has been to make things light and to make the world believable, that in fact it can't exert force on you. So with this, the seaweed flows. There's like a bit of a sense of things moving in front of you as you move the current of the water. And that's going to be our approach going forward, giving the player situations where their movements actually make sense, and we, in a way, avoid the problem of the player being infinitely strong, having absolute momentum in the world, presenting no resistance. And from that point, I'd like to give over to Ruan Rothmann. Yeah, thank you.
Hey guys, do you want to take a question or two while I just try and move the laptop? Hi. So thanks for being at this talk. Thanks for Evan for taking the heat off and doing the hard part of following up from Crow's rather amazing talk. So I'm kind of going to be basically saying what Evan has said before, but in different words, bearing in the spirit of repeating things a lot. I titled my section of the talk The Illusion of Weight, and specifically my game is called Gorn. It's a violent, over-the-top, physics-based gladiator simulator currently being built for the Vive. And yeah, it's basically like Mosh Pit Simulator, but just a bit toned down. And so obviously, the first thing that we want to try and do with VR games that we can do to an extent that we haven't been able to before is to really immerse the player. I don't really want to try and define and talk about immersion. I think it's a concept that everybody is fairly familiar with at this stage. But specifically in how it relates to Gorn is that the player is fighting gladiators, and he's fighting gladiators with heavy weapons. And it's really important that if this universe is going to feel real in any way, that the weapons that the player carry feel heavy. When you hit something, it needs to react in a way that makes sense to your brain. There needs to be a viscerality to the interactions in the game. And then just following from that, I think about immersion is that the player needs to eventually be able to construct a model of how the universe works, and things should then behave consistently according to that model. So I don't think realism is at all important, but consequent behavior definitely is. And so something that Evan has touched on, that I'm going to repeat a little bit here, is one of the interesting things that came to light working on a VR game and how it differs from working on a traditional 2D or flat game. So like he's also said, in a traditional game, the player controls an avatar inside the game world. And this avatar can be constrained to the rules and the bounds of the world. If there is a roof right above the player's head and he presses the jump button, you can stop the player from jumping. You bump his avatar's head into the roof and he drops back down, and that's it. If you can't walk through a wall, your avatar can't pass through a wall. In VR, we don't have these constraints. The player can, in the real world, always do anything regardless of the consequences in the virtual world. I think there is still a distinction between player and avatar, but it's really, it's almost non-existent in VR. And that's really exciting, and it's an interesting constraint to try and embrace. So if we can't constrain the movements and the motions and the momentum of the player, what we can do is we can compensate by constraining the world around the player. So, how this applies to my game and what I've been working on is specifically the wielding of heavier weapons. So again, we can't constrain the player or his avatar. So in a traditional game, if the player is carrying a heavy object, we can adjust the animations to reflect that this object is heavy. We can slow down the motion of the player, etc. In VR, we can't do that. Nothing can ever feel heavier than the controller that you're holding. That is the weight of the object in his hand, and you can't slow the player's arm down. And what you see in a lot of games that have large objects, that the entire object is one solid thing, and then the player can do small wrist motions that shouldn't be possible for an object with that weight, and this kind of breaks the immersion and it destroys the illusion that the object is actually heavy. And I think this has been solved better and better and more, but you also can't prevent the player from trying to push the microphone through a box or stuff like that. So I have a small video to, I kind of doubt whether anybody doesn't follow what I've been saying. But you can see here, the head of this mace is supposed to be a couple of kilograms, maybe 5 kilograms heavy. But by just flicking my wrist, I can move it around like that. So it doesn't feel like it has weight at all. It's weightless. It feels like a balloon object. And I have another video here where I'm just pushing it through the floor, which is kind of, I mean, this is something that everybody does in VR games. They like put their hands through the floor, they like put their head through the walls and stuff. And when you're modeling objects as this one big solid thing, it just doesn't work. So what I've done, and I think what I've also seen other people do more and more to get around this, is just model an object as several pieces and driven by physics. So the handle is still perfectly follows the hand of the player, which I think is important. Early on, I tried moving handles of objects away from where the controller is, and it just, there's an incongruence there that doesn't feel good. So yeah, and then Gorn is well known for having wobbly spaghetti weapons, and this gets around this. Now it means, because the handle of the weapon is essentially elastic, I can give the top of the object where the weight is concentrated inertia, which creates a feeling, an illusion of weight. Let me just demonstrate that with video. So in this video, similar to the previous one, I'm wobbling the handle. I'm immune to jokes, like you can try. Right, so you can see that the inertia of the mace keeps the head relatively still, even though I'm moving the handle a great amount. And this creates this illusion that actually there is weight concentrated at the tip of this thing. And it looks silly here, but it does create a genuine feeling of weight. And then after working with this, this is just a quick image of showing the implementation, but there's not that much to it. It's the two rigid bodies connected with a joint, and then I do a lot of lying to show where the handle supposedly is. But it is actually just a bunch of standard Unity rigid bodies. And after doing that, and I felt I had some interesting results, I started wondering, like, how can I make objects that look and feel even heavier than just something that you can carry in one hand? How do you make something that is too heavy to be wielded in one hand, and how do you make it feel too heavy that a player will naturally try and use it with both hands? So I think I'm actually going to show this video first. So, and this is a big two-handed warhammer that's being used in the game. And the first thing is, you see if I grab it at the top, the rotation of the object doesn't grab, so that the bottom lags around. So this means that you can't orient it with only the one hand. You have to use both. In addition, there's like a ton of drag on the head of the hammer, which means that you can't just swing it around like a small light object. And the combination of those two things have been really successful in signaling to players immediately that this is intended to be used with two hands. Then the next kind of problem that comes up with that is, like, sure, the player is grabbed onto it with two hands, but they can move their hands further and closer apart at any time. So which is easily solvable by just having a sliding grip here, like you can see. But the problem that stems from that is that when the player's hands are really close together, you have the same problem as with a light one-handed object. You can just move them around really quickly. I need like a broom handle to demonstrate this. Evan, do you want to like demonstrate? Right. So if you hold it with your hands like really close together, like your hands basically on top of each other, you can't move it with any kind of speed because you don't have real power. If you actually want to move it conveniently, you have to put your hands far apart, and you can easily move it around. So to help constrain the player and to teach them that this object is too heavy, thanks Evan, that was lovely. I dynamically alter the strength of the joints that connect the top of the hammer to the bottom of the hammer depending on the distance between the hands. So when the hands are really close together, the shaft goes really, really wobbly and weak, and it's hard to control the hammer, and it just kind of like flops around aimlessly. And as you move your hands further apart, it becomes more and more rigid until it's like a really solid weapon. And that means that just because you're putting your hands far apart, the motions that you can do are heavier. You have to turn your entire back if your hands are far apart like this. You can't just like do little weird motions with your wrist and get a lot of momentum out of them. And then I have a little demonstration here. It's not on a real gladiator. I think these just kind of go over what I've been talking about, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, the spirit of this is to encourage the player to play along. I want the player to pretend that the object is heavy. And to further do this, when the player hits the object, besides just affecting the strength of the joints that make up the thing, I add an extra bonus force if the player's arms are really far apart. If they're pretending that this hammer actually weighs 20 kilogram, I give like an extra boost to impacts that come out of it. So I got a demonstration pinata here. So here my hands are like close together, and I'm like just gonna like tap him a couple of times. And even though the hammer is like moving at a reasonable speed, he doesn't really take much of the velocity because the thing is that you wouldn't be able to use a hammer like that. It's okay, he can't feel pain, he's cool with this. But then if I move my hands far apart, and I do like the only kind of full body motion that you do, I add a lot of bonus momentum. So this subtly encourages players to play along with the momentum of the world. So I wonder if I can play it in slow motion. I should have had more videos of people hitting stuff in this, I guess. But yeah, I mean, you can see the hands are far apart. I don't think the head of the hammer is moving quicker than it did in the previous sets, but I'm just adding this stuff because the player has agreed to this contract of pretending that the hammer is heavy. I do some other things in the game as well, where I want to just encourage the player to pretend that they're a gladiator. And I think like those small touches have really added a lot more than I've thought. I asked the player to like salute at the beginning of a round. At the end of a round, you have to raise both your arms like a winner before the game will continue. And the first couple of rounds, it's like kind of weird, but after a while, players get into it and they actually like incorporate that into their play style. Like they do cinematic celebrations, even though the game doesn't really care. You just need to raise your arms. I think that's pretty much the gist of my talk. I don't know what the future is for this kind of thing. I think trying to encourage the player to play along has been a surprising thing, and I think we need to find new ways of asking the player to suspend their disbelief, because there are new ways for them to just break their own immersion and to build their own sense of disbelief. And that's kind of, yeah, I find that interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing what other people do with that going forward. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Thanks for listening. I think just saying thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And
Any questions? Is this one off?
this one
Baba, okay. You mentioned that one of the most important, very important consequence that different objects react in a sort of a predictable style in the end. No? So, but for example, for the hammer, the predictable style you showed was consistent with the interface. So if I have my hands farther apart, then the impact will be stronger. It's obviously not realistic, and it's not the consequence is not the one I would expect with a real hammer. So the question is, how important is it that I actually start with having realistic physics? For example, I obviously cannot move the hammer and it moves at the same speed as my hand, because it wouldn't in the physical world do that. But then once the player has accepted the rule that there is something, for example, a dependency on how I hold it, then I can bend the rules, and now I can actually hit the hammer as if it was a physical object, much harder, even though I now break away from this. It's no longer ruled. I have defined a new rule, basically. Okay, the question is, how much do we have to stick to realism in the beginning, and how far can we how well can we instruct the player that there are different rules once they have messed around with it for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, I think I get away with not having a lot of realistic physics, partly because the game is stylized in the way that it is. There are cartoon stars above the guys' heads, and the game is stylized because I don't want to set the expectation that the world should behave realistically. I think as long as you can just establish some intuition in the player, as long as you can just get them to do something intuitively, I don't think it needs to be realistic at all. I've seen there are some magic games where you telepathically manipulate objects, which obviously isn't realistic, and I think those work super intuitively, and the player understands that the consequence of their actions. Is that answering the question a bit? Right, but you can't do it realistically. I mean, or I don't know how to. Yeah.
That was sort of where I suppose our approach was. We wanted a realistic person in an avatar in the play space, but the problem then is the avatar is infinitely strong, or it's as strong as they can lift their motion controllers. So, I mean, our solution there was to create a world that conformed to that nothing would need to, nothing, if they swung anything around, it would never break their sense of immersion. And I think with Ruan's game, with Gorn, he's not in a position to do that because it's already a power fantasy, and it just becomes like a absurdist power fantasy if you let players play exactly, as if they're not even in the world. Does that make sense?
Okay, there was one other question, or two.
It's like me.
I'm running.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned that you had only 2 rigid bodies. How do you make that the mesh follows these rigid bodies? How do you interpolate them?
It's actually simpler than you think. I create a Bezier curve between the 2 points. So you take the forward transform of the handle, take a back transform of the head of the mace, you construct a triangle, and then you Bezier curve between the 2 points and put the bones of the skin mesh there. If you've worked with skin mesh before, I think it's not that hard.
And did you encounter any problems with the Unity joints?
That is like all I've been doing is encountering problems with Unity joints. That's been my job. I think a lot of them is encountering problems with my knowledge and skills of working with Unity joints. So, but I mean, it just takes a lot of experimentation. You try to do something in 3 or 4 different ways, and one way turns out to be correct, and then you discover something, and you have to change everything later. But yeah.
Because the problem is, if you have a joint, then in your game the player still can theoretically move the controller really fast. So how did you solve the problem that the joint glitches out if the player moves the handle too fast?
That's a very implementation specific. Each joint and each weapon has different solutions for different kinds of glitches. The short answer is you shouldn't use fixed joints ever, pretty much. And when something does glitch out, it is almost always 2 joints trying to resolve constraints that aren't compatible. So you just need to figure out what are the 2 constraints that the solver is trying to solve that's causing it to glitch out, and relax one of them. And that's kind of the strategy. But yeah, it's a lot of tweaking and a long process.
Is it correct in saying instead of using fixed joints, you're using really large forces? So it would be a configurable joint with then near infinite forces, but that's still more stable than a fixed joint with absolute forces. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, one last question was here.
Thanks to both of you for the talk. I just wanted to ask a question regarding something in both demos. I noticed you had visual indicators for kind of showing force or impact, and I was also wondering about sound and, say, haptic feedback. how important you think they are, like how soon you bring them into your development, and how much you kind of focus on them trying to create this idea of weight and physics.
Yeah, I mean, those are also obviously huge. I think we're used to haptic feedback a little bit with Xbox controllers, and we're used to doing things with sound. So I wouldn't say it's second nature, but it's things that I'm definitely familiar with. And something will never feel impactful if it doesn't sound good. And I think haptics add a bit, but I don't think I'm very good at using them. The heavier the object is, you faster, and the faster it moves, the more the controller vibrates, and that's about it. But there's a lot of sound. Jason, I don't know if he's here, sound designer on Gorn, has been doing great work, like really visceral sound effects. And yeah, I mean, that makes the impact work. But it's also not a solved problem, but it's something that we're better at with games than making physics in VR for sure. Yeah,
Cool. Thanks very much.
Okay, then thank you very much for being here with us.
thanks.